out!
The film industry's entire premise has been to create a whole new world out of nothing.
Hello? Hello? Anybody home?
And the better they got at this, the more convincing it became, the more effective this objective was.
Sorry, baby, I'm not buying.
I'm not asking you to buy, just hold me close.
The privilege of working within a two-dimensional space meant that the only limits were beyond the screen. It didn't matter how it was done, it just had to seem real, so that for the next 2 hours, people could escape their often dull, monotonous lives and enter a world where all their problems didn't exist.
Morning. It's a lovely morning. Good morning.
But no matter how immersive these films were, absolute suspension of disbelief was never possible. There was always one thing missing, and it took until around the 1930s for Hollywood to finally get it right. Color. Obviously, the real world is not black and white, and that was the immediate giveaway, that what you were looking at was not reality, and never could be. But how could we make this world indistinguishable from ours? Could we actually get the chance to fly over the rainbow? Well, that's what The Wizard of Oz did, in quite the literal sense, back in 1939. While The Wizard of Oz was not the first color movie, it was the first movie to use color as part of the plot, which retrospectively established that the industry would be different moving forward. The line between fantasy and reality was thinning. But what if I told you it actually wasn't? Obviously, The Wizard of Oz is a fictitious movie, but what if the very thing that makes it stand out, its vibrant colors, was all a lie? Just an illusion to trick your eyes into seeing something that isn't really there, much like the Land of Oz itself. This was a process known as Technicolor, a term colloquially derived from the name of the company which popularized it, and its presence really is no different from all those convoluted movie sets that make you believe you're seeing something that isn't real. Known more formally as the three-strip color process, it actually isn't even color at all. Technicolor was a science so sophisticated, so brilliant in its design, that it became the industry standard for nearly 50 years. But it wasn't always the rainbows and roses it vibrantly portrayed itself to be. It was a process often full of stress, financial barriers to entry, industry politics that often hindered its true potential for many decades. Technicolor was the grandest of them all, both figuratively and literally, and we're going to take a look at just exactly what was happening behind the curtain. The concept of a camera all starts Talk about a world of color, because that is exactly what Bespoke Post brings to your door. Bespoke Post is a monthly membership club that delivers products from small businesses directly to you. Not only is it completely free to join, but members can skip a month or cancel at any time. 90% of the products come from small brands, many of which are based right here in the US. Every month they introduce their members to cool new products. They've got awesome clothes, cool stuff for your house, camping and cooking gear, basically just high quality stuff in every category. And when you join, you just fill out a little quiz, and it'll send you shipments based on your interests, which you can preview in advance. And if you don't like something, you can always just swap it for something else, making sure that you get exactly what you want. Their membership program also offers great deals year-round, up to even 30% or more on products. Let's see what Bespoke Post has in store for me, like my little camera here. Very old school, completely analog, no electricity, and creates color images using the three-strip process, which we'll get into in a minute. I heard it rains in Kansas. That was very on the nose. I also got some lomography camera lights to really enhance those photos. There is no place like home, so why not make home just a little bit more colorful with a box full of magic and love? You will get a free mystery gift with your first membership purchase. Click the link in the description and enter NSGift at checkout or go to bespokepost.com/NSGift because you are capable of more than you know. Bespoke Post. There is no place like home. The concept of a camera all starts with a very simple premise. You have a very tiny hole that allows light of your subject to come through. This hole is small enough to turn that light into a viewable image. This image can be reflected on a wall, a canvas, anything. This is called a camera obscura, and it is a technology that has existed for thousands of years. It was even used for tracing a lot of famous paintings, many during the Renaissance. But then photography came around and made this process much quicker. What if you had a box that put this camera obscura inside of it and reflected that image on a plate covered in light-sensitive chemicals? Bright parts of the image would leave a dark scorch mark on the plate, and the dark parts of the image would remain the same color as the plate. You now have a negative image of your camera obscura on this plate. You put it through a process that inverts the colors. Ta-da! You have photography. Now, there's a lot more that goes into a camera than just that, but that is the very fundamental concept of how the technology works. And as it got better, throughout the 19th century, photos went from taking several hours to produce to under a second. And eventually, you could take so many photos at once that when they are all laid out quickly in a sequence, it looks like they are moving. You have the moving picture, or movie for short. But you may be noticing an issue here. Because this chemical process only worked with either light or dark, you were only working with either black or white, or something between that. Because you can't exactly just capture color, just like how your shadow doesn't have color on it. Because light is light. You were only going to get the outline of what was there. So naturally, only black and white photography was possible. You did have very rare cases of experimentation with color photography at this time, but we will get into that in a minute. No matter how high quality or impeccable that photograph is, it would never truly replicate the scene it depicted, all because of this one barrier. And what if I told you that right now, in the 21st century, that was actually still the case? You've probably been told growing up that The Wizard of Oz was hand-painted, frame by frame, and that was how it was made in color. Wrong. Very wrong. Yes, this was actually done with some movies back in the early 1900s, but they were a couple of minutes long, with little change in scenery, so it was doable. Hand painting, frame by frame, a 2-hour movie with the grandeur and diversity of The Wizard of Oz, they would still be working on it today. There just had to be a quicker method. What if there was actually no color at all, but instead we just tricked the audience into thinking that there was? Oh hi, didn't see you there. Today we are going to talk about our colors. You like my little painting I did there? Now, the human eye contains things called cones, and these cones are able to detect 3 kinds of color: red, green, and blue. These are technically the only colors that we can see. Any other colors are just variations of these colors being mixed together. Kind of like how mixing red and blue creates purple. How nice. These are called primary colors, and the colors that we just created are called secondary colors. When mixing light, the primary colors are red, blue, and green, or additive coloring. When mixing materials, they are red, blue, and yellow, or subtractive coloring. But the whole point of film is to replicate what our eyeballs see in the real world as closely as possible. And we have green cones, not yellow ones. So we use green as our third color. Movies like The Wizard of Oz were not filmed on just one black and white reel, but 3. You would have a black and white reel that only focused on the red colors in an image, one that only focused on the green colors, and lastly, one that focused on the blue colors. On the red black and white film reel, all the objects that are red are very bright, and in the green reel, the green objects are bright, and so on. These reels would then be soaked in dyes of the opposite colors, which were cyan, magenta, yellow, and sometimes a 4th one, which we call the key reel. This is where the term CMYK comes from. Now, the reason for doing this is because the opposite colors will show up the least on these bright spots. You don't want yellow to show up where the blue is, for example. The key reel acted as the foundation and helped make things look much richer. And much like mixing paints, when you mix all these film reels together, huzzah, color. I even recreated this at home with my camera, taking only black and white images. I took a red filter, placed it in front of the lens, snapped a photo. Then took a green filter, snapped another photo, and did the same with the blue. I digitally dyed these photos on my computer and mixed them all together. And sure enough, a beautiful color photo, created only through black and white. Because it isn't actually color at all. It is your eyes tricking you. This revolutionary technology was popularized in the 1920s by a company called Technicolor. But at this time, it only used red and green. This is what gives 1920s film that very distinctive look. Incorporating a third color, such as blue, was not yet possible, and there is a big reason for this. You may have even noticed this exact problem with the home experiment that I just showed, and it's actually one of the big reasons for why colored film took so long to become the norm. Notice how I had to take 3 different photos with 3 different filters on them that had to be as close to each other in appearance as possible. This is easy for stationary settings like photography, but obviously when you are filming something, you can't do multiple takes of the exact same camera angles and the actors moving in the exact same way. It's just impossible. So what do you do? Well, earlier technologies like Technicolor tried combating this through having a red and green disc that spins so fast, every other frame would be either red or green filtered. When these frames were then separated, dyed, and played on top of each other, you got pretty decent color for the time. But because these frames are just fractions of a second off, it creates almost this latency effect, like something you would see on a bad CRT television. The process Technicolor used would perfect this. Their color cameras included a prism that divided the image into these color channels as it was being filmed, simultaneously in real time. But there was one problem. They could only be divided into 2 colors. There just wasn't room for a third one. Same with Technicolor, as adding a third color to the wheel would make this frame delay even worse. And red and blue gave a way uglier appearance than red and green. So red and green became the standard throughout the 1920s as the 2-strip color process. But in the 1930s, Technicolor eventually figured out a way to incorporate a blue strip by putting it in the same spot as the red strip without diminishing the quality of either reel. And so 3-strip color was born. So if you've ever wondered what was truly the first color movie ever made, it would be Walt Disney's Flowers and Trees from 1932. And for live action, it would be Becky Sharp from 1935. And so throughout the 1930s, color movies, while the minority, were not exactly uncommon. The Wizard of Oz survives as the most memorable one because of how it used color in the film. But it wasn't even the most popular color film of 1939. It was ranked at number 8. But despite all of this, it would take nearly 30 years until color film took over. And it was for one big reason. It was expensive as hell. As we mentioned, these productions used 4 times the amount of film reel compared to traditional black and white film. And because all these reels were running at the same time, they were very loud. So they had to be encased in soundproof boxes and be good proximity from the set microphones. Remember how in my digital demonstration I had to really up the contrast and the lighting? Yeah, Technicolor productions required a ton of light. The set of The Wizard of Oz was said to be over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Just imagine wearing that huge lion costume in that heat for hours on end. How did he not get heat stroke? Not only that, the Technicolor company had to have employees supervising set at all times, making sure that everything was being done correctly, which also included a Technicolor consultant who specialized in choosing the right color palettes. And to top it all off, this was all being done on a camera that costed $30,000 in 1930s money. Yeah, Technicolor was gorgeous, but a pain in the ass. It is no wonder why it took so long to become standard. Black and white photography, although not nearly as immersive, wasn't really all that far removed from reality. So people at the time tolerated it just fine, and were still able to suspend their disbelief for a couple of hours. In fact, it was often removed from reality in quite the satisfactory way. It offered a degree of separation from the world that was less parasocial, because viewers could just remind themselves that, at the end of the day, what they were seeing was just make-believe. It also had an effect on how people dealt with true events, like sensitive news stories. It's much easier to watch footage of the Vietnam War in black and white, because it makes the events feel farther away. This is a whole other world. It couldn't happen to me. If you met Elvis in person, you would probably faint. I would probably faint. But instead, you can watch him in the comfort of your own home. Film and television allow you to feed into your curiosity of what is being shown on the screen without the consequences. And with black and white, it was even more so. And it's this exact frame of thinking that allowed black and white pictures to serve as their own form of art in the film world, which prolonged its dominance over color. A lot of people at the time actually liked that movies didn't perfectly replicate reality. We even saw this with silent films. And there was actually great controversy when it was approaching its obsolescence. Phonograph records were already very popular when silent films were a thing. Hell, the technology itself even predates film. I mean, technically, silent films should have never even existed in the first place. Well, not exactly. If you wanted to release a film internationally, all you had to do was change the language of the dialogue cards. Way cheaper than creating multiple recordings of voice actors that spoke different languages. Additionally, phonographs and film projectors at the time did not move at the same rates, so the two mediums couldn't sync properly. This was finally fixed in around 1927, the year The Jazz Singer came out, and then silent films were pretty much history by 1930. But even though these new talkies were technologically better, a handful of people didn't think it was aesthetically better. It's important to keep in mind that these technologies were often an extension, an adaptation of the art forms that preceded it. Notice how all the films from the early 1900s are filmed from only one camera angle, across an entire stage, much like a play. Well, the reason for that is obvious. Before film, only theater existed. The perspective of being in the audience, watching a live performance on a stage, was the only shared experience they had. It's all they knew. But as movie moguls like D.W. Griffith and Cecil B. DeMille innovated the landscapes, film as an art form became more derivative. And for many cinema snobs, they saw talkies as a regression. Silent film actress Lillian Gish was actually quite pissed. Silent films strongly emphasized emotion and atmosphere. Adding any dialogue would just take away from that. If she wanted to talk in a performance, she would just go back to the theater. That was my suffragette-era woman impression. The 1929 re-release of Phantom of the Opera actually received some negative reviews for adding sound to some of the scenes. Ultimately, this was not how the majority of people felt at the time, and because it was much cheaper than color to implement, talkies prevailed rather than coexisted with silent films. But because the technological and financial limitations of color weren't all that distracting, black and white did coexist just fine for many decades. What could be seen as an opportunity to cut down on costs could now also be seen as an opportunity to actually make black and white elevate the film. The movie Psycho is a great example of this. Due to the controversial nature of its premise, like gore and showing a toilet flushing on screen, Alfred Hitchcock struggled to get a lot of funding for the film, so he settled for black and white rather than color. But it was a bit of a blessing in disguise. Hitchcock felt that the gore and violence would be way too much for audiences at the time in vibrant color. Finding a sort of middle ground would allow him to push the envelope while also keeping the audience conditioned to the cleaner entertainment of the time. But the black and white also serves as a symbol of Norman Bates and Marion Crane's monotone lives and their desires to escape to something more exhilarating. But cutting costs really did help. Fake prop blood did not have the right consistency on camera, so they used chocolate syrup instead. It's black and white. You can get away with it. I always love sharing that fact. A Hard Day's Night was also filmed in black and white for budgetary reasons, because English rock bands were just a fad. But it was also an opportunity for the studios to take advantage of the French New Wave style that was gaining popularity in the 1960s. It also served as a parody of the news reports and rockumentaries made about boy bands at the time, many of which were filmed in black and white. With Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Bette Davis wanted the film to be black and white because she thought color would make a sad story look pretty. Orson Welles was so headstrong on Citizen Kane being black and white, he actually shot down any attempts to digitally colorize it decades later. All these directors found a compromise and used it in a way that actually enhanced the nature of the film. 3-strip color over time would eventually get cheaper to print, and by 1954, a company called Eastman Color would master the art. It wasn't as vibrant as Technicolor, but so much cheaper and less work to produce. Though Technicolor's IB printing process would still be used, so nearly all movies after this date had the Color by Technicolor credit. But much like talkies, since color had gotten so much easier, this was when it started to truly take over. 1967 was the first year more color movies were made than black and white. And when color video took over television in the late 1970s, film stock and printing improved with Eastman throughout the 80s, and then digital video entered the scene by the late 90s, the look of color was now different to what it was with Technicolor and the early days of Eastman Color. This is exactly why Technicolor film looks different, almost like a painting. It was a much more controlled environment than these later innovations were. Like we mentioned, you needed special lighting, a color consultant, all kinds of things that were no longer necessary with the improvements made with Eastman Color. They also used different film stocks than they did decades later, or even no film at all once digital video took over. And lastly, it's also because the printing process, projectors, and screens that were used to show these films were just not as good as they are now. In other words, Technicolor looks older because you were watching it on old technology back then. But if you remaster some of these old films, it really doesn't look all that different from films today. And the small things that make Technicolor look different aren't exactly difficult to replicate. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood did this with Leonardo DiCaprio in a sort of Forrest Gump kind of effect.
Oh, you'll still be here when I get out.
Cooler.
Because that's what film is at the end of the day. Deception, making you see something that isn't really there. In fact, the basic principles of Technicolor's 3-strip process are still with us today. Because digital is all done on a screen, you are dealing with light. Instead of CMYK, we use RGB. You are instead combining the corresponding colors, not the complementary ones. This is the main reason Technicolor has a different look. Digital works with an additive light process, while Technicolor uses a subtractive dye process. Old televisions work the same way. Much like film, they also focused on changes in light, therefore only making black and white possible. So they had to follow the same methods. Whether it was pixels, phosphor dots, or color wheels like with Technicolor, they were combining RGB lights in ways that your eyes wouldn't even notice them, therefore creating a beautiful color image. In fact, I did this myself with my own CRT television that only broadcasts black and white. All I did was play 3 different versions of the black and white broadcast that focus on the RGB colors, tinted them, and then presto, color out of thin air.
Hi, Mrs. Brady. It's Mr. Phillips.
Sure, it's Mr. Phillips.
Feeling better?
Not well enough to go in that broken down barnacle barge of yours.
We discovered this technology quite early on, but because the transition from black and white to color in the film industry was so slow, like we just demonstrated, it made more sense to just keep the black and white sets for the time being and save production costs. But that begs the question, what was the last black and white movie? I mean, obviously, they're still making black and white movies even today, but that's not what I mean. There is a difference. Black and white today is treated more as a novelty rather than a practicality. Movies like The Lighthouse, Pleasantville, Paper Moon are all black and white because they are paying homage to the old. A Raisin in the Sun is in black and white because it is old. What was the last movie from the olden days? To answer this question, we first need to define what a true black and white film is. Going back to what we mentioned, black and white was something that was just tolerated because of its cost effectiveness. But filmmakers were still able to work with what they had and make something creative with it. Nowadays, color videography is cheap, so this problem doesn't exist anymore. Now black and white only serves as the novelty, whereas back then it was often both. But if we are strictly sticking to movies that were made in black and white because it was the most feasible resource at the time, for budgetary reasons, there actually is an answer for the last old black and white movie. Clerks. After that, the golden age of Hollywood was officially dead. Well, maybe that's a bit extreme, because you could argue that it never even died to begin with. The 3-strip color Technicolor process is still with us and is present in our everyday lives, just taking on new forms, whether it's through your phone or your computer screen. And just like the sets in Ben-Hur or the Emerald City itself, none of it is real. It is all an illusion, making you see something that isn't really there. It is the place where technology and art come together, helping us connect with more of our world, while also giving us the chance to better understand it and come to our own conclusions, even if it's through artificial means. Because the fact of the matter is, there isn't really a rainbow. But sometimes it's fun to pretend that there is. If you enjoyed this video, consider supporting me on Patreon or buying me a coffee, all in living Technicolor. A special thanks to my patrons and channel members for making this video possible. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you never miss a future video.